On the afternoon of November 24th, 1989, an 18-year-old college freshman laced up her running shoes, stepped out the front door of her family home, and started jogging down a quiet country road. She had done this hundreds of times before. Same road, same route, same dog running beside her. She knew every curve, every house, every stretch of open field along the way. This was her road, her neighborhood, the place where she had grown up, where everyone knew her name, and where she had never once felt afraid. It was less than a quarter mile from her own front door when she vanished. 2 hours later, her dog came home alone, shaking, cowering, too terrified to even step off the front porch. The dog had come back, but the girl was gone, and for the next 28 years, her killer would live freely among the same people who mourned her, eating at the same diners, shopping at the same stores, walking the same streets, hiding in plain sight. Her name was Mandy Stavik, and this is her story. But to understand what happened to Mandy, you first need to understand the place she called home. Not because the geography matters, but because the feeling of that place, the trust, the safety, the silence, is the very thing that made this crime possible. Acme, Washington. A rural community so small that most maps barely show it. It sits about 15 miles east of Bellingham, tucked along Highway 9 in Whatcom County, the most northwest corner of the entire state. Out here, the properties stretch wide. 10 acres, 20 acres, some even 25. The houses sit far back from the road with thick trees and open land between them. There are no streetlights, no sidewalks, no traffic, just long, winding roads, green hills, and the kind of deep quiet that most people only hear in their dreams. But the thing that made Acme different from any other small town was not the land. It was what the people believed about it. They believed nothing bad could happen here, and they had every reason to think that. Families in Acme had lived on the same land for generations. Grandparents had raised children here, and those children had raised their own families on the same soil. People would tell stories about what your grandmother said to their grandmother 40 years ago. That is how well everyone knew each other. The sheriff at the time would later say the area had almost no crime at all. People left car keys in their ignitions when they went inside. They left their front doors wide open on summer nights. If your car broke down on the side of the road, you would not wait 5 minutes before someone stopped to help. There is a saying people in small towns like this use. You may not know everybody, but you know somebody who knows everybody. In Acme, that was not just a saying, it was the truth. And in a place like that, you do not walk around scared. You do not look over your shoulder. You do not think twice about going for a jog alone on a Friday afternoon because why would you? You know these people. These people know you. Nothing has ever gone wrong here. That is what Mandy Stavik believed. That is what her mother Mary believed. That is what the entire town of Acme believed. They were all wrong. Among the families that lived in Acme was a woman named Mandy Stavik. She lived at the end of a dead-end street about a mile off the highway in a house that sat far back from the road. Quiet, private, tucked away from everything. Mary was a single mother. She had moved to Acme from Alaska after her marriage ended. She brought her children with her, her daughter Molly, her son Lee, and her youngest, a girl named Mandy. She came to Acme because it was safe, because it was quiet. Because after everything she had already been through, she needed a place where her family could start over. And the thing Mary had already been through was something no parent should ever have to survive. See, Mandy was not the first of Mary's children to be taken from her. Years before they moved to Washington, back when the family was still living near Anchorage, Alaska, Mary had another child, an older son. His name was Brent. In 1975, Brent went out hunting on a piece of property near the Fort Richardson Army base, just outside Anchorage. He had permission to be there. He was authorized to be on that land. It was a normal day, a routine trip, the kind of thing he had probably done many times before. But Brent did not come home that day. When they found him, he had been shot, not once, not twice, 17 times. 17 bullets. In the body of a young man who had done nothing wrong, and the person who pulled that trigger has never been found. No arrest, no suspect, no trial, nothing, just silence. For over 50 years now, Brent Stavik's murder has remained completely unsolved. So when Mary packed up her remaining children and moved across state lines to start a new life in Acme, Washington, she was not just looking for a fresh start. She was running from something, running from the horror of what had happened. Running from the town where her oldest son was taken from her, running toward the only thing she wanted, safety. And Acme gave her that. For a while, the kids grew up on that dead-end street. They went to school, they made friends, they became part of the community. Mandy was growing into a young woman full of energy and ambition and light. And slowly, carefully, life began to feel normal again. The fear faded, the trust grew, and Mary allowed herself to believe, maybe just a little, that the worst was behind her. She had no idea that in just a few years, history was going to repeat itself. That on a quiet Friday afternoon, the day after Thanksgiving, her youngest daughter would walk out the front door and never walk back in. But we are not there yet, because before we get to what happened on that road, you need to know who Mandy Stavik really was. Not just a name in a case file, not just a missing person on the evening news, but a real person, a living, breathing 18-year-old girl who had dreams and plans and people who loved her more than anything in this world. And once you know who she was, what happened next is going to hit you even harder. If you ask anyone in Acme who knew Mandy Stavik, they will not start by telling you how she passed. They will start by telling you how she lived. Because Mandy was not the kind of person you describe with just one word. She was not just smart. She was not just athletic. She was not just kind. She was all of those things, all at once, all the time. And she made it look easy. At Mount Baker High School, Mandy was the girl who did everything. She played varsity basketball, number 13 on her jersey. She played varsity softball. She ran track. She was a cheerleader. And as if 4 sports were not enough, she also played 3 instruments in the school band: clarinet, flute, and saxophone. But even that does not come close to telling the full story. Mandy was fluent in sign language. She could speak Japanese. She had worked as a lifeguard, which meant she was not just a strong swimmer, but strong enough to save other people in the water. She was an honor student, and her dream after college was to become a commercial pilot. 18 years old, 4 sports, 3 instruments, 2 extra languages, a lifeguard, an honor student, and she wanted to fly planes for a living. This was not a girl who sat back and waited for life to come to her. This was a girl who chased it down, grabbed it with both hands, and squeezed every drop out of it. Her mother Mary would later say that Mandy wanted to be the best at everything she did, and the people around her would say, he usually was. But the thing that made Mandy unforgettable was not what she could do. It was who she was. There was a warmth to her that people still talk about to this day, a light, the kind of energy that fills a room the moment she walked into it. She had this wide, open smile that people say you could feel in your chest. She did not just look at you when she talked to you, she looked through you, like she genuinely cared about every word you were saying. After her parents divorced and her father stepped back from the family, a man named Jim Freeman quietly filled that space. Jim was Mandy's high school basketball coach, but over time, he became much more than that. He became her mentor, her guide, the closest thing to a father figure she had during her teenage years, and Mandy knew it. Before she left for college, she sat down and wrote him a card. In it, she told him he was the one person who had inspired and influenced her more than anyone else in her entire life. She thanked him. She told him he was the greatest, and she signed it, most sincerely, Mandy Stavik, class of '89, number 13. Jim Freeman would later stand in front of nearly 1,000 people at Mandy's memorial service and give her eulogy. He would say that when you looked at Mandy, she smiled right back at you, right at your soul, with eyes that said, "I love life." That was who she was, not a case number, not a name in a headline, a real, breathing 18-year-old girl who was just getting started. In the fall of 1989, Mandy enrolled at Central Washington University. She had gone in wanting to be a commercial pilot, but by the middle of her first semester, she was already rethinking her path, not because she was unsure of herself, but because she had so many interests pulling her in different directions that picking just one felt almost impossible for someone like her. When Thanksgiving break came around that November, Mandy decided to come home. Her boyfriend Rick drove her back to Acme, and that evening, the family sat together. Mary, Molly, Lee, and Mandy. They ate, they laughed, they talked about everything and nothing. It was warm, it was full. It was the kind of Thanksgiving that stays in your memory forever. Nobody at that table had any idea that it was the last normal evening this family would ever share together. The next morning was Friday, November 24th. The air was cold and the roads were quiet. Sometime around 2:30 in the afternoon, Mandy told her mom she was going out for a run. This was completely normal. Running was part of who Mandy was. Whenever she was home, she ran the same route down Strand Road to where it ended at the Nooksack River, then turned around and came back. Most days, her mother Mary would ride her bike alongside her while she ran. It was their thing. But on this particular afternoon, Mary stayed behind. Her sister was visiting for the holiday, and she did not want to leave her alone. Mary would think about that decision for the rest of her life. Years later, she would say just 2 words about it. She said, "I kicked myself." So it was just Mandy and Kyra, the old German shepherd who had been by her side for years. Protective, loyal, always right beside her on every single run. The two of them stepped off the porch and headed down Strand Road together. What happened over the next 30 minutes is something that investigators would spend the next 3 decades trying to piece together. We know that Mandy ran her usual route down to the river and turned back. We know that on her way home, a delivery man named David saw her run past his van. He did not think anything of it. Just Mandy doing what Mandy always did. A little further up the road, her brother Lee was at a friend's house, the Anderson place, roughly halfway between their home and Highway 9. Lee looked out and saw his sister jogging past. Just a normal afternoon, nothing out of the ordinary. And then, the last person to ever see Mandy alive. A man in a pickup truck had pulled to the side of the road near the final bend before Mandy's house. He watched her run right past him. She was heading home. She was almost there. 3 people saw her in those final minutes. A delivery man, her own brother, and a stranger in a truck. All 3 of them watched her pass by. All 3 of them thought nothing of it, and not one of them had any idea that somewhere between that last sighting and her front door, someone was waiting. Investigators would later say that Mandy's attacker had to have been in a vehicle. She was too fast a runner to catch on foot. They believe someone pulled up beside her, most likely pointed a weapon at her, and forced her to get in. It happened fast, it happened quietly, and it happened in broad daylight on a road where she should have been safe. But before anyone even knew something was wrong, there was silence. The road was empty. The afternoon stretched on. And inside the house, Mary went about her evening, expecting to hear the front door open any minute. It did not. 2 hours passed, and then the sound of paws on the porch. Kyra came home, but she was not the same dog that had left with Mandy. She was shaking, trembling. She would not step off the porch. She cowered near the door like something had broken inside her. Investigators would later say that whoever took Mandy had likely kicked or struck Kyra hard enough to send her running, hard enough to shatter the protective instinct that had kept her by Mandy's side for years. Mary saw the dog. She saw the fear in its eyes, and she knew, before the phone calls, before the search parties, before any of it, she knew. A mother always knows. She picked up the phone. Her hands were shaking. The first person she called was Mandy's boyfriend, Rick. He had not seen her. The next call went to the sheriff. And then every single person she could think of. Within the hour, the entire community of Acme was outside, searching for Mandy Stavik, on foot, on horseback, on all-terrain vehicles. Neighbors who had known Mandy since she was a child dropped everything and headed out into the cold. Because in a town like Acme, when one family is in trouble, the whole town responds. But as the hours turned into a full night, and that night turned into the next morning, and still no sign of Mandy anywhere, the hope that she had just gotten lost or fallen somewhere began to fade, and a new kind of fear began to settle over this community. The kind of fear that people in Acme had never felt before. The kind that whispers the one thing nobody wants to say out loud. Something terrible has happened, and whoever did it might still be out there. Every case you see here takes nearly 2 weeks of research, long nights, deep dives, and a commitment to getting the facts right. We do this because someone out there still deserves to be remembered. Subscribe if you want more, and tell us in the comments which moment from today's case hit you the hardest. More cases are waiting for you in the description. Now, back to the story. That first night was the longest night Acme had ever known. Dozens of people spread out across the area in the dark, calling Mandy's name into the cold November air. Flashlights moved through the trees along Strand Road. Neighbors who had known the Stavic family for years walked through ditches and open fields, hoping to find her sitting somewhere, hurt maybe, but alive. On horseback, on all-terrain vehicles, and on foot, this tiny community moved as one. But the hours kept passing, and there was no sign of her. By the next morning, the search had grown even larger. Volunteers from surrounding areas joined in. Search and rescue teams arrived with tracking equipment. A professional tracker was brought in to work with Kyra, hoping the German shepherd might lead them back to wherever Mandy had gone. But when they brought Kyra outside and tried to guide her off the porch, she would not move. She pressed herself flat against the ground near the front door and refused to take a single step forward. Whatever had happened to that dog out on Strand Road, it had broken something inside her. And for the people watching this unfold, that was one of the most disturbing moments of the entire search. Because if whatever happened out there was violent enough to shatter the instincts of a protective German shepherd, then what had it done to Mandy? Inside the house, Mary was barely holding on. She had not slept. She could not eat. Every minute that passed without a phone call or a knock at the door felt heavier than the one before. Her daughter Molly tried to keep hope alive. She told herself that maybe Mandy had slipped during her run. Maybe she had fallen into a ditch and twisted her ankle. Maybe she was just out there somewhere waiting for someone to find her. It was a thin hope, but it was the only thing keeping this family from breaking completely. And outside, something was changing in the town itself, something that had never happened before. For the first time in anyone's memory, people in Acme started locking their doors at night. The car keys that had always stayed in the ignition were quietly pulled out and put in pockets. Parents who had never worried about their children playing outside suddenly called them in before sunset. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone felt the same thing. The trust that had held this community together for generations was cracking. On November 26th, 2 days after Mandy vanished, a search team covering the smaller side roads found something. A pair of green sweatpants lying on the ground near a back road. Mandy had been wearing teal sweatpants and a light-colored sweatshirt when she left the house. Investigators brought Mary to the scene to take a look. She stared at them. They were dirty, ripped, full of holes. After a long pause, she shook her head. She did not believe they belonged to Mandy. The pants were sent to a crime lab anyway, and the results would eventually confirm that they had nothing to do with the case. Another dead end, another small piece of hope, gone. Then came November 27th. 3 full days since Mandy had walked out the front door with Kyra by her side. A local fire department had taken their boats out onto the Nooksack River. The river ran close to Mandy's running route, and investigators wanted every inch of it searched. The team moved slowly upstream, scanning the banks and the shallow water as they went. And then, in the south fork of the river, roughly 6 miles from the Stavic home, caught in some debris near the bank, they found her. She was face down in the water. The only things still on her body were her socks and her running shoes. Her sweatpants were gone. Her sweatshirt was gone. Even the Walkman she had been listening to during her run was gone. To this day, none of those items have ever been found. One of the men on that recovery team was Ron Peterson from the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office. He had been trained just recently by the FBI on how to handle and preserve DNA evidence, and he knew that the way he pulled Mandy from the water could make or break this case down the line. But Ron Peterson was not just an investigator, he was a father. And when he reached into that river and turned Mandy over, he later said she looked like his own daughter. Someone would ask Ron Peterson a question years later that no one had ever asked him before. They asked, "When you lifted her out of the water, did you say anything to her?" He paused for a long time, and then, very quietly, he said, "I got you." 2 words, spoken to a girl who could no longer hear them, but he said them anyway. Because in that moment, standing in that cold river holding this young woman in his arms, it was the only thing left to say. What the autopsy would reveal over the next few days turned everything darker. The medical examiner confirmed that Mandy had been sexually assaulted. Her cause of death was asphyxia by drowning. There was a deep wound on the top of her head, a blow hard enough to knock her unconscious. And her legs were covered in scratches and cuts, deep ones, the kind you get from running at full speed through the thick, thorny blackberry bushes that grow wild all across that part of Washington state. And that detail, those scratches, told investigators something that still haunts everyone who has worked this case. Mandy had tried to escape. At some point during the attack, she had broken free, and she ran, through dense brush, through blackberry thorns that can tear through clothing and skin like razor wire. She ran without her pants, without protection, from the thorns ripping into her legs with every single step. The pain must have been unbearable, but she kept going. She fought through it. Because Mandy Stavik was not the kind of person who gave up, not on the basketball court, not on the track, and not in the worst moment of her life. But whoever was behind her was faster, or closer, or simply would not stop. They caught her. They struck her across the top of the head, hard enough to knock her unconscious, and then they carried her to the river and placed her body into the water. The water at that spot was barely knee-deep. And Mandy Stavik, the girl who had spent her summers as a lifeguard, who had been trained to save other people from drowning, could not save herself, because she was no longer conscious. She never had a chance. She was 18 years old. Nearly 1,000 people came to her memorial service. There was no church in the area large enough to hold that many people, so the service was held at Mount Baker High School, the same hallways she had walked through, the same gym where she had worn jersey number 13. Her coach, Jim Freeman, the man she had called her greatest influence, stood before the crowd and gave her eulogy. People wept openly. Families held each other. An entire community sat together in silence, broken by the same question. Who did this? It was a question that hung over Acme like smoke. In the grocery store, at the diner, on the street, everywhere people went, they looked at each other differently now, not with trust, but with something colder, something sharper, because everyone understood the same terrible truth. Whoever did this to Mandy was not some stranger passing through. This was not a random act. Whoever took her knew these roads, knew her route, knew when she ran and where she ran, which meant the person who ended Mandy Stavik's life was someone they all knew. The memorial ended. The flowers were cleared away. People went back to their homes and tried to carry on. And somewhere in that same community, just a few minutes down the road from where the Stavic family was drowning in grief, the man who had done all of this simply went back to his normal life, as if nothing had happened. And the investigation to find him was about to go nowhere for a very, very long time. In the weeks after Mandy's memorial service, investigators threw everything they had at this case. The first person they looked at was the person closest to her boyfriend Rick. He and Mandy had been together for about 3.5 years, on and off toward the end. Rick had actually driven Mandy home from college for that Thanksgiving weekend, so naturally he was the first name on the list. But when detectives sat Rick down, he did not hold back. He answered every question before they even finished asking it. He volunteered details on his own. He did not hesitate. He did not get defensive. He did not ask for a lawyer. Investigators would later describe his statement as extremely forthcoming. Rick loved Mandy, and whatever had happened to her, he had absolutely nothing to do with it. He was cleared. So if it was not the boyfriend, then who was it? This is where things took a critical turn. Because while most crime labs in the country were not equipped to work with DNA evidence in 1989, the FBI's lab was. And Ron Peterson, the same man who had pulled Mandy from the river and whispered, "I got you," had just returned from a training course at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. He had been taught how DNA could be used in criminal investigations, and he knew that the samples recovered from Mandy's body might one day become the most important piece of this entire case. So he sent them to the FBI, and the results came back with 2 DNA profiles. One was Mandy's, the other belonged to an unknown male. For the first time, investigators were holding the killer's genetic fingerprint. His identity was right there, sealed inside a lab report. But the technology to match it to a real person did not exist yet. DNA databases in 1989 were brand new, nearly empty. When they ran the profile through the system, nothing came back. No match, no name, no face. It was like holding the answer to the biggest question this town had ever asked, and not being able to read it. So investigators did what they could. They worked the case the hard way. Tips poured in from everywhere. Over the course of the investigation, more than 7,000 leads were followed up on, 7,000 phone calls, 7,000 names, 7,000 conversations that led to 7,000 dead ends. Every suspicious vehicle that had been spotted in the area, every rumor whispered at the diner, every name that someone handed to a deputy after Sunday service, each one was chased down, checked out, and crossed off. One of the early suspects was a man named David Suchi, a local drifter who had been seen in the Acme area around the time Mandy disappeared. His name kept coming up. Investigators got a warrant, collected his DNA, and sent it off for testing. The results came back. Not a match. Ruled out. Then there was John Wisniewski, a drug dealer from the area who had been telling people something disturbing. He said he might know who was responsible for what happened to Mandy. That was enough to put him on the radar. But when investigators questioned him, he gave them nothing solid. He talked in circles. He hinted at things, but never said them outright, and his DNA did not match either. But there was something about Wisniewski that one detective could not let go of, something in the way he spoke, the way his eyes moved when he answered a question. It was not proof, but it was enough to keep the door open. Years later, when a new detective took over the case, he tracked Wisniewski down, not across town, not across the state, across the world, all the way to Cambodia, over 8,000 miles for one conversation. The detective sat across from Wisniewski in a foreign country and looked him in the eye. His gut told him this man was hiding something, but Wisniewski stuck to his story. "I don't know who did this." 8,000 miles. And the detective flew home with nothing. As the years dragged on, the phones stopped ringing. The tips dried up. The file that had once sat on the top of someone's desk moved to a drawer, then to a shelf, then to a cabinet in the back of a room. The case never officially closed, but it slowed to a crawl. One detective retired. Another one took over. Then that detective moved on, and someone else stepped in. Over the course of this investigation, the case passed through 3 different sheriffs, 3 leaders, 3 promises, and still no arrest. Meanwhile, something was happening in Acme that no one talked about, but everyone felt. The dark cloud that had settled over this community the day Mandy was found in that river, it never lifted. People went to work, they raised their families, they smiled at each other in the grocery store. But underneath all of it was a quiet tension that had not existed before, a suspicion, an unease that sat in the pit of your stomach and never quite went away. Because everyone understood the same terrible truth. Whoever had done this to Mandy had never been caught, which meant he could still be right here, standing behind you in line at the store, sitting 2 rows behind you at church, waving at you from across the street. Over the years, more than 30 local men stepped forward and voluntarily gave DNA samples. 30 men who opened their mouths, let a swab touch the inside of their cheeks, and waited for the results. And every single one of them came back clean, not a match. But here is the thing that no one realized at the time. The one man they needed was not among those 30. He had never been asked, he had never been approached, he had never been questioned. Not because he was hiding in some faraway place, but because he lived right there in the same neighborhood, just a few doors down from the Stavic family. And somehow, in all those years, in all those interviews, in all those thousands of leads, nobody ever knocked on his door. And through all of it, Mandy Stavik waited. She did not leave Acme. She stayed in the same house, on the same dead-end street. She watched the seasons change from her window year after year after year. Her hair turned gray. The lines on her face grew deeper. In her 70s, she was still out in the front yard splitting wood by herself. Tough, quiet, unbroken on the outside, but carrying something on the inside that no one could see. She once said something that tells you everything about what those decades felt like. She said, "I don't think I ever believed, ever, that they would catch the guy." A mother who had already buried 1 child to violence in Alaska, now watching the years pass from a small house in Acme, believing deep in her heart that her daughter's killer would walk free forever. 1990 passed, then 1995, then 2000, then 2005. The world outside changed, but inside that house time stood still. Then, in 2009, something shifted. A detective named Kevin Bowie inherited Mandy's case. Bowie was not new to this. He had been a rookie deputy back in 1989 when Mandy disappeared. He had gone to the same high school as her. He had driven past the stretch of road where she was taken more times than he could count. This case had lived inside him for 20 years, and now it was officially his. Bowie came in with a plan. He had studied a famous case in England where investigators solved a crime by testing the DNA of every man in a small community until they found their match. Acme was small, rural. The number of men who had lived there in 1989 was limited. If he could find all of them one by one and get their DNA, eventually he would get his answer. In theory, it was the kind of plan that could crack the case wide open. In practice, it was 4 more years of slow, grinding work. Tracking down men who had moved away decades ago, knocking on doors in towns across the state, collecting sample after sample, and every single time the same result, not a match. 4 more years, dozens more samples, and still nothing. But then something happened, something that had nothing to do with a detective or a lab or a case file. Something so small, so ordinary, that nobody saw it coming. In June of 2013, on a warm, sunny afternoon, 2 mothers brought their children to a local water park. They sat down on the grass while their kids ran off to the slides. They barely knew each other. They started talking. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, one of them brought up a name that had not been spoken out loud to law enforcement in over 2 decades. For 24 years, 2 women in this community had each been carrying a secret, a gut feeling, a dark suspicion that they had never shared with anyone, not with the police, not with their families, not with their closest friends. Because in a small town, accusing someone of something like this without proof is terrifying. But on that afternoon, sitting in the sun, watching their children play, they said his name, both of them, the same name, at the same time, and everything was about to change. It was a warm afternoon in June of 2013. 2 mothers sat on the grass at a local water park while their kids played on the slides. Their names were Heather Backstrom and Marilee Anderson. Both had grown up in the Acme area. Both had gone to Mount Baker High. But they barely knew each other. They were just 2 women making small talk to pass the time. Then another mother nearby brought up a name, Mandy Stavik. 24 years had passed, but in Acme, that name still carried weight, and the moment it was said, the small talk between Heather and Marilee stopped. Something shifted between them. A look passed across their faces that neither of them had ever shared with another person before. Heather spoke first. She said she was pretty sure she knew who did it. Marilee looked at her, and then, quietly, she said, "So do I." For over 2 decades, each of them had been carrying a name, a suspicion, a dark feeling they had never told anyone. Not their families, not their friends, not the police. Because in a town as small as Acme, pointing a finger at someone without hard proof could ruin a life. And what if they were wrong? So they stayed silent, year after year, alone with it. But sitting on that grass, they realized something that made the hair on their arms stand up. They were not just carrying the same suspicion, they were carrying the same name. Timothy Bass. Heather told her story first. It happened in the summer of 1989, just a few months before Mandy disappeared. Heather was 15 years old. Timothy was 21. After a local softball game, a group of people decided to head to Dairy Queen. They all climbed into the back of a friend's truck, and Timothy ended up right next to her. On the ride, he leaned in close. He told her that her eyes were beautiful. He stared at her in a way that made her feel trapped. And then he reached into the cup holder, pulled out a pen, and began slowly rubbing it up and down her bare legs. She was wearing cut-off sweatpants. She was a 15-year-old girl. He was a grown man, and nobody around them seemed to notice. She froze. She wanted to scream but could not. She wanted to move but did not. She sat there, heart pounding, until the ride was finally over. And when she got home that night, she told no one. Not that week, not that year, not for 24 years. When Marilee heard that, her face went white, because what had happened to her was far worse. July 1991. Almost 2 years after Mandy's death, Marilee was home alone one evening with her young son. Her husband was out of town. The house was quiet and dark. Then she heard a knock. She opened the door. Timothy Bass was standing on her porch. He said he had been hunting all day and needed to use her phone to call his wife. Marilee felt uneasy. Something about his presence at that hour felt wrong, but she told herself she was being paranoid. He was her husband's friend. He just needed the phone. So she let him in. Timothy took the phone and started dialing. But as Marilee watched him, she heard something that made her stomach drop. A sharp, repeating tone. The sound a phone makes when the number does not exist. He was not calling his wife. He was not calling anyone. The number was fake. And he knew she could hear it. Then Timothy stopped pretending. He set the phone down. He walked past her, through the kitchen, past the room where her baby was sleeping, and he walked straight into her bedroom. He turned and looked at her and told her that he used to drive past her house just to watch it. He said he had always been in love with her, and then he told her he wanted to make love to her. Right there, right now. Marilee was alone. Her baby was in the next room. There was a man standing in her bedroom who had just made it clear that the phone call was a lie and that he had come for something else entirely. She told him to get out. He did not move. She told him again. He stayed. It was only when she threatened to call the police that Timothy finally, slowly walked out of her house and into the dark. She locked the door behind him, and she never told anyone until that day at the water park. Marilee contacted a detective she knew from high school. His name was Ken Gates. She told him everything, both stories, hers and Heather's. And for the first time in 24 years, the name Timothy Bass was on the desk of an investigator. What they found when they started digging was enough to make every detective on the case stop what they were doing. Timothy Bass had lived on Strand Road, the same street as the Stavic family, just a few houses away. His property sat right along Mandy's daily jogging route, which meant every single time Mandy went for a run, she passed directly in front of his home. If Timothy was sitting by his window on any given afternoon, he could have watched her go by. And based on what investigators would later learn, that is exactly what he did. Timothy had gone to Mount Baker High School, same school as Mandy. His younger brother Tom had actually been friends with her. But there was a detail that no one had ever mentioned before. A witness came forward and revealed that Timothy, who had no connection to the school's sports programs, had started attending Mandy's basketball games. He would sit in the stands and watch her play. He had no child on the team. No reason to be there, but he showed up again and again. He was not just a neighbor who happened to live nearby. He was watching her, studying her, learning her patterns. When investigators dug even further into Timothy's past, the picture that formed was deeply unsettling. As a teenager, Timothy was described as a loner, quiet, uncomfortable around people. He struggled to make friends and had almost no social life. But there was a specific moment that people close to him still remember as the turning point. After a high school girlfriend broke up with him, Timothy called her on the phone, and while she was on the other end of the line, he picked up a gun and fired it. He claimed he shot into the air, but the girl on the phone heard the blast, and the message behind it was unmistakable. After that night, the people closest to Timothy noticed a shift. Something had hardened inside him. His brother Tom would later say that Timothy developed a deep disgust toward women. His sister-in-law Robin would put it more bluntly. She said Timothy genuinely believed that women were inferior to him, less than him, objects to be controlled. And then, just 2 months after Mandy Stavik was pulled from the Nooksack River, Timothy Bass got married. Her name was Gina Malone. She would later say that she did not marry Timothy out of love. She married him to escape a difficult situation at home. He was young. She thought marriage would give her freedom. Instead, it gave her a cage. From the beginning, Timothy controlled everything. What she wore, where she went, who she could speak to. He did not treat her like a partner. He treated her like property. Go get me a drink. Make me food. Shut up. Those were not occasional outbursts. Those were daily commands. The people around them watched it happen and could do nothing. At one point, Gina tried to escape. She filed for a restraining order. She started divorce proceedings. She packed her things and left, but Timothy found a way to pull her back. He told her he would lie to the judge. He said he would have her children taken away from her. And for a mother, that threat was enough. She went back, and she stayed for nearly 30 years. They moved to Everson, Washington, about 19 miles north of Acme. They had 3 children together. Timothy got a job driving a delivery truck for a local bakery. He had no criminal record, no arrests, no red flags in any database. To anyone looking from the outside, he was just a quiet man living a quiet life. But inside the house, there were moments that now carry a very different meaning. Gina would later tell investigators that Timothy loved watching crime shows, the kind where old cases get solved through forensic evidence and DNA. He would sit on the couch and watch detectives catch killers, and instead of being horrified, he would criticize them, not the killers, the ones who got caught. He would shake his head and say, "Why didn't he cover his tracks? How could he be so stupid? I would have done it differently." At the time, Gina thought nothing of it. It was just Timothy being Timothy. But years later, when she finally understood what her husband had done, those words would echo in her mind like a confession she had been too close to hear. Timothy Bass had been living his life in plain sight for a quarter of a century. He drove his bread truck every morning. He came home every night. He sat at the dinner table with his children, and he carried inside him a secret so dark that it had poisoned everything around him without anyone ever knowing the source. But now, his name was in the hands of the police, and the next move would be theirs. Investigators went to Timothy Bass's home. They knocked on his door. They kept it casual, friendly, non-threatening. They told him they were looking into an old case and just wanted to ask a few questions. When they brought up Mandy's name, Timothy's reaction told them more than any answer could. He paused. He looked up, and then he said, "Mandy? Mandy. Oh, yeah, she was that girl they found in the river. In a town as small as Acme, where nearly 1,000 people had attended her memorial service, where her name had been spoken in every household for the past 24 years, Timothy Bass acted like he could barely remember who she was. He had lived a few doors down from her family. He had gone to the same high school. His own brother had been friends with her, and he sat there, pretending she was just some name he had maybe heard once or twice. The lead detective on the case would later say that this was one of the biggest red flags he had ever seen. Because in Acme, forgetting Mandy Stavik was not possible. Everyone remembered her. Everyone. Then the investigators asked Timothy if he would be willing to provide a voluntary DNA sample. And this is where Timothy made his second mistake. He refused. He looked at the detectives and said, "I watch those crime shows. I see how many people go to prison because they give their DNA." The investigators left that day without a sample, but they had something almost as valuable. They had a man who pretended not to remember the most well-known crime in his community, and then refused to clear himself when given the chance. In 2015, investigators came back and asked him again, and again he said no. So the police tried a different approach. They went to the place where Timothy worked, a local bakery outlet called the Franz Bakery. Their plan was to get close to his delivery route, follow his truck, and collect something he threw away, a cigarette butt, a coffee cup, anything with his DNA on it. When they arrived at the bakery, they spoke to the manager. Her name was Kim Wagner. They told her they were investigating one of her employees and needed access to information about his delivery routes. But they did not tell Kim which employee, and they did not tell her why. Kim was uncomfortable. She told them she was not in a position to share that kind of information and asked them to contact human resources at the corporate office. Corporate, in turn, told the investigators they would need a search warrant. Without enough evidence to get one, the police were stuck. Again, another wall. Another dead end. But then, years later, something small happened that changed everything. Kim was out one evening with her husband and some friends. They were talking about coworkers. Someone in the group happened to know Timothy Bass and mentioned something that Kim had never heard before. Timothy used to live on the same street as Mandy Stavik. Kim felt the room tilt. In that moment, everything clicked. She realized that the investigators who had come to her bakery were not looking into some minor workplace issue. They were investigating the most horrific crime her community had ever known, and the man they were looking at was someone she worked with every single day. Kim Wagner was 19 years old when Mandy was taken from this world, just 1 year older than Mandy, and now, decades later, Kim had a daughter of her own. The thought of Mary Stavik growing old in that house, never knowing who had taken her child, hit Kim in a place she could not ignore. When investigators returned to the bakery in 2017 and asked for her help again, Kim did not hesitate. She pulled the detective into her office and asked him point blank, "Is this about Mandy Stavik?" When he confirmed it was, Kim told them she would do whatever it took. But getting Timothy's DNA was not going to be easy, because Timothy Bass was careful, disturbingly careful. He had started wearing gloves at work. He never threw personal items into the trash cans at the bakery. He took all of his garbage home with him. He was the only employee who did not turn in his work uniform to be laundered by the company. He did not smoke, so there were no cigarette butts to collect. It was as though he knew, on some level, that someone might one day come looking for exactly this. The investigators told Kim something important. They could not legally ask her to collect evidence on their behalf. That would make any DNA she gathered inadmissible in court. But if she happened to come across something on her own and chose to turn it in, they could accept it. Kim understood, and from that day forward, she watched Timothy like a hawk. Every day at work, she emptied the trash cans so they would be clean. She kept her eyes on him during breaks. She waited for the moment he would slip up. Days passed, weeks passed, months passed. Timothy threw nothing away. He was disciplined, almost robotically careful. 3 months went by. And then, on August 10th, 2017, it happened. Timothy got a drink from the water cooler. He drank from a plastic cup, and when he was done, for the first time in months, he tossed the cup into the trash can. A few minutes later, he threw away a can of Coke as well. Kim's heart nearly stopped. She waited until Timothy walked away. Then she moved quickly. She grabbed the cup, she grabbed the can. She put them in a bag, slid it into her desk drawer, and closed it. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was pounding. But she had done it. She turned the items over to the investigators, and the evidence was sent to the state crime lab for DNA testing. Weeks went by, then months, and then the phone rang. The lab technician on the other end said 3 words that changed everything. "We have a match." The DNA on that cup matched the DNA that had been pulled from Mandy Stavik's body 28 years earlier. It was him. It had always been him. On December 12, 2017, investigators drove to the bakery parking lot. Timothy Bass was just finishing his shift. As he walked toward his vehicle, they stopped him. They told him he was under arrest for the kidnapping, the assault, and the taking of Mandy Stavik's life. As the handcuffs clicked shut, the lead detective leaned in and said, "You are under arrest for what happened to Mandy Stavik." Timothy's response was strange, almost detached. He said just 3 words, "We got him." The detective paused, and then Timothy added, "Who?" 28 years. That is how long he had walked free. And in the end, it was a plastic cup in a trash can that brought him down. That same evening, Whatcom County Sheriff Bill Elfo drove out to Acme. He pulled up to the same house on the same dead-end street where Mary Stavik had been waiting for nearly 3 decades. He knocked on her door, and when she opened it, he told her that an arrest had been made. It was December 12, 2017. Mary Stavik's 81st birthday. Before the trial even began, Timothy's defense team tried to throw out the DNA evidence entirely. They argued that Kim Wagner had been acting on behalf of law enforcement when she collected the cup and the can, which would make the evidence illegal. A hearing was held in August of 2018. Kim took the stand and testified that the decision to collect those items had been entirely her own. No one asked her to do it. No one told her to do it. She did it because she wanted the truth. The judge ruled in her favor. The DNA stayed in. When Timothy Bass finally went to trial in May of 2019, his story had changed completely. The man who once said he barely remembered Mandy's name now claimed they had been secret lovers. He told investigators that he and Mandy had met while he was out mountain biking with his father. He said they started spending time together and eventually began a physical relationship. He said they had been intimate again the weekend she came home for Thanksgiving. His father, the only person who could have confirmed the story, had passed away years earlier. There were no phone calls between Timothy and Mandy, no letters, no messages, not a single witness who had ever seen them together, not one person in the entire community who had ever heard either of them mention the other's name. There was nothing. Just the word of a man who had lied about knowing her in the first place. The prosecution laid out their case clearly. Timothy's DNA was found inside Mandy. She had been taken by force. She had been assaulted. She had been struck in the head and placed in a river to make sure she did not survive. This was not a relationship. This was a crime. The defense argued that the presence of DNA only proved contact, not force. They said someone else must have been responsible for what happened after. But as the trial went on, the people closest to Timothy began to turn on him, one by one. And each time someone took the stand, his story fell apart a little more. His wife Gina, who had spent nearly 30 years living under his control, filed for divorce during the trial. She came back to the investigators and admitted the truth. She had lied. Timothy had pressured her into giving him a false alibi for the day Mandy disappeared. She had told police she was with him that afternoon. It was not true. Then it came out that after his arrest, Timothy had slipped a note to his mother during a jail visit. In that note, he asked her to tell the police that the two of them had been out Christmas shopping together the day Mandy vanished. He also asked her to do something even more disturbing. He asked her to blame the crime on his own father, a man who had been dead for over a decade. His mother refused, but the most damaging testimony of all came from his own brother, Tom Bass. Tom had been friends with Mandy in high school. He had known her, he had cared about her, and now he was being asked to take the stand against the person who had taken her life, his own brother. Tom testified that in 2015, after investigators had asked Timothy for a DNA sample for the second time, Timothy came to him with a request. He told Tom that he had slept with Mandy the weekend of Thanksgiving, and then he asked Tom to go to the police and say that he had also slept with her. Timothy wanted to make it look like Mandy was, in his words, a loose girl, so that his story about consensual contact would seem more believable. Tom refused. He would not lie, and he would not let his brother drag Mandy's name through the dirt to save himself. On May 24, 2019, nearly 30 years after Mandy Stavik was taken from this world, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty, first-degree murder, guilty on all counts. Mary Stavik was sitting in the courtroom when the word was read. So was Molly. So were the people of Acme who had carried this weight for 3 decades. The room exhaled. Tears fell. Families held each other. At his sentencing, Timothy stood before the court and said, "I am 100% innocent of this crime." Then he paused and added, "But the better man in me says I should say very little today. Give this day to the Stavic family." The judge was not moved. He sentenced Timothy Bass to the maximum allowed by law, 320 months, nearly 27 years in prison. He could not receive a life sentence because prosecutors had not charged him with premeditated murder, a charge they were not confident they could prove. The judge looked at Timothy and said, "For 30 years you have lived free from the responsibility of your actions. But that life has been a lie, and tragically it has caught your family, your mother, your brother, your ex-wife, and your children in its web." Timothy Bass is currently in prison. He is planning to appeal. His earliest possible release date is January of 2036. But this story does not end with him. It ends with 3 women. Heather Backstrom, who carried a dark memory from the age of 15 for over 2 decades. And finally had the courage to say it out loud at a water park. Marilee Anderson, who survived a terrifying night alone with her child, and 22 years later picked up the phone and called a detective. And Kim Wagner, who spent 3 months watching and waiting in a bakery, emptying trash cans every single day until the moment finally came when she could do what the entire justice system had not been able to do for 28 years. 3 women. 3 moments of bravery, and 1 name that had been whispered in silence for far too long. Every year since 1990, a scholarship has been awarded in Mandy's name to a student at Mount Baker High School who was active in the school's music program. The community had originally raised $25,000 as a reward for information leading to an arrest. When years passed with no arrest, that money was donated to the scholarship fund so that Mandy's name would not just be remembered for how she was taken, but for how she lived. Mary Stavik waited nearly 30 years for someone to knock on her door and tell her that the man who took her daughter had finally been held accountable. She was 81 years old when that knock came. She had lost 2 children to violence in her lifetime. One case was never solved. But this one was. And somewhere in Acme, Washington, on a quiet dead-end street, the doors are still unlocked, the roads are still empty, and the memory of an 18-year-old girl who played 3 instruments, spoke 2 extra languages, ran track, played basketball, and dreamed of flying planes still lives in the hearts of everyone who knew her. Mandy Stavik did not get to live the life she was meant to live, but the people she left behind made sure her story was never forgotten. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Timothy Bass would have ever been caught if those 2 women had not spoken up at the water park that day? Do you believe his story that he and Mandy had a secret relationship, or do you think he made the whole thing up after he was cornered? And finally, Kim Wagner spent 3 months collecting evidence that the police legally could not ask her to get. Do you think what she did was brave, or do you think it crossed the line? Let me know what you think in the comments below.